Elias Thorne was a man who captured sounds for a living. As a professional Foley artist and field recorder, he had traveled the world to record the cracking of glaciers and the hum of desert winds. But nothing prepared him for the valley of Blackwood Hollow. Elias arrived in the secluded village following an old legend about a singing stone that supposedly mimicked voices from centuries ago. He carried his high-end parabolic microphones and digital recorders like talismans against the oppressive silence of the moors. The village was a cluster of gray stone cottages huddled together as if hiding from the wind. The locals were polite but wore a strange accessory. Every single villager had a small piece of red wool tied around their left ear. "It's for the echoes," the innkeeper, a weathered man named Silas, whispered as he handed Elias his room key. "In this valley, sound doesn't just travel, it stays. If you hear your own name called from the woods, Mr. Thorne, don't answer." Elias laughed it off. "I'm here to record, Silas. I want the sounds the rest of the world has forgotten." "The world forgot them for a reason," Silas replied, his eyes darting to the darkening hills. That night, Elias set up his equipment on the balcony of the inn. He put on his headphones and pushed the gain to the maximum. At first, there was only the white noise of the wind. But then he heard it, a soft, rhythmic clicking. Click-clack, click-clack. It sounded like a woman knitting. But as he adjusted the frequency, the sound changed. It became the sound of a bone snapping. Over and over. Snap, snap, snap. Then a voice drifted through the headset. It was crisp, clear, and terrifyingly familiar. "Elias, come and see the view." It was his mother's voice. His mother, who had been dead for 10 years. Elias ripped the headphones off. The balcony was empty. The village was dark. But in the distance, near the mouth of a cave, known as the Throat, a pale light flickered, pulsing in time with the sound of a heartbeat that shouldn't have been there. The recording meter on his device began to redline, even though the night was now perfectly silent. Elias didn't sleep. He sat at the small wooden desk in his room, staring at the digital waveform on his laptop screen. The recording of his mother's voice was impossible, yet there it was, a perfect spectral match. But as he played it back for the 10th time, the file began to distort. The words, "Elias, come and see the view," began to stretch. The V in view became a low, animalistic growl. By the end of the clip, it sounded like wet leather tearing. A soft knock at the door made him jump. He opened it to find a young woman standing in the dim hallway. She looked no older than 20, with eyes that seemed too large for her pale face. She held a small chalkboard. Written on it in shaky white script, "Give me the sound." "Who are you?" Elias asked. She pointed to herself, then wrote, "Clara." She pulled back her hair to reveal her left ear. Unlike the others, her ear wasn't just tied with red wool. It was scarred, the ear canal seemingly fused shut. She pointed at his recorder and shook her head violently. She grabbed the chalk and scribbled, "IT is a vulture. It eats what you say." Before Elias could respond, a sound drifted up from the floorboards. It was the sound of Elias's own voice from 5 minutes ago. "Who are you?" But it didn't come from Elias. It came from the shadows under his bed. Clara immediately shoved her fingers in her one good ear and dropped to her knees, her eyes squeezed shut. The voice under the bed repeated the question, but faster, higher. "Who are you? Who are you? Who are you?" Then, the sound of Elias's laptop clicking shut echoed from the empty corner of the room. The echo was mimicking the environment in real time. Elias grabbed his heavy flashlight and shone it under the bed. There was nothing there but dust. Yet, the voice continued, now shifting into the sound of a child crying. A sound Elias remembered from a recording trip to an orphanage years ago. Clara grabbed Elias's hand and pulled him toward the door. She led him out of the inn and into the misty street of Blackwood Hollow. The village felt different at 3 a.m. The gray stones seemed to vibrate. As they passed the village well, Elias's parabolic mic, which he was still carrying, picked up a cacophony. It wasn't the wind. It was hundreds of voices, all layered on top of each other, whispering the same thing. "Repeat after me. Repeat after me." Clara led him to a small stone shed, the village tannery. Inside, she lit a candle and pointed to the walls. They were covered in thousands of scraps of red wool. She wrote on her board, "The god of echoes has an O voice of its own. It stole mine in the cave. Now it uses my mother's voice to call me back. If you record it, you give it a map to your soul." Elias looked at his digital recorder. The record light was blinking red, even though he hadn't touched it. The device was recording on its own, and the file name was changing. The air in the tannery grew heavy, vibrating with a frequency so low Elias felt it in his teeth. Clara's eyes went wide. She grabbed her chalkboard and scrawled one word in massive, jagged letters: "Run." They burst out of the shed, but the village of Blackwood Hollow had transformed. The gray stone cottages seemed to lean inward, narrowing the path. At the end of the street, the villagers stood in a semicircle. They weren't holding pitchforks or torches. They were standing perfectly still, their hands over their ears, humming a single, monotonous note. "The hum," Elias whispered. His parabolic microphone began to scream with feedback. He tried to switch it off, but the buttons were fused. The digital screen on his recorder was now scrolling through his entire life's work. Recordings of rain, city traffic, his father's funeral, playing them all back at once in a chaotic, high-pitched blur. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thorne," a voice boomed. It was Silas, the innkeeper. He stood at the center of the crowd, holding a heavy iron tuning fork. "The god of echoes hasn't had a new voice in a long time. The old ones are wearing thin. They're becoming static. You're feeding it to me?" Elias shouted, but his own voice sounded hollow, as if he were speaking into a long, metal pipe. "We feed the stone so the stone doesn't feed on us," Silas replied. He struck the tuning fork against the stone well. The sound was bone-shaking. As the vibration hit Elias, he felt a sickening tug in his chest. It wasn't physical pain. It felt like his memories were being pulled out through his throat. Clara grabbed a heavy stone and hurled it at Silas, but the villagers moved as one, a silent wall of flesh. They weren't angry. They looked terrified, their eyes weeping from the sheer pressure of the frequency. "Look at the ground, Elias," Silas shouted over the roar. The cobblestones were beginning to glow with a faint, rhythmic pulse. The singing stone wasn't just one rock. The entire valley was a singular, ancient crystalline structure. The village was built on top of a giant, sleeping ear. Suddenly, Elias's recorder exploded in a shower of sparks. The sound didn't stop. The echo of the explosion hung in the air, repeating, growing louder, turning into a rhythmic thrum that matched the beat of Elias's heart. The echoes were no longer just mimicking, they were taking over the rhythm of his biology. Clara pulled Elias toward a narrow gap between the houses that led toward the moors. "The throat," he realized she was gesturing. "The cave. If we go there, we're dead." Elias yelled. Clara shook her head and pointed to the red wool on the walls. She grabbed a handful of the bloody, raw wool from the tannery floor and stuffed it into Elias's ears. The world went silent. The hum vanished into a dull throb. But in the silence, a new sensation emerged. He could feel the ground speaking through the soles of his boots. The god of echoes wasn't in the cave. The cave was its mouth, and they were standing on its tongue. The silence provided by the red wool was a mercy, but a fragile one. As Elias and Clara scrambled into the darkness of the throat, the damp air felt thick, vibrating against Elias's skin like an invisible swarm of insects. He kept his hand on the cold, wet wall to guide himself, but the moment his palm touched the stone, he recoiled. The walls weren't just stone. They were covered in a translucent, pulsating film. Elias pulled his flashlight and clicked it on. The beam revealed thousands of Sound-Leeches, gelatinous, slug-like organisms clinging to the limestone. They didn't have eyes or limbs. They were essentially living diaphragms. As the light hit them, they rippled, and despite the wool in his ears, Elias felt a vibration deep in his skull. He pulled the wool from his ears for just a second. "Please, Elias, it's so dark. Help me." It was his mother's voice again, but it wasn't coming from the air. It was coming from a cluster of leeches near his head. They were vibrating in perfect unison to recreate her vocal cords. Clara grabbed his arm. her eyes pleading. She pointed to a deeper part of the cave, where the leeches were larger, some the size of human torsos, hanging from the ceiling like grotesque, fleshy bells. Suddenly, Elias's broken digital recorder, which he had tucked into his jacket, began to emit a high-pitched whine. The screen flickered to life, glowing a sickly violet. A new file had been created, mother_final_wish.mp3. The device played automatically. Elias, the voice sobbed. It sounded so real, he could hear the wetness of her breath. The thing in the dark. It won't let me go unless it has a new instrument. I need your tongue, Elias. If you cut it out and leave it on the altar, I can walk out of here. Please be a good son. Elias felt his hand drifting toward his pocket knife. His mind was a fog of grief and frequency. The leeches on the walls began to mimic the sound of a knife sharpening against a whetstone. Shuti, Shuti. Clara stepped in front of him, her chalkboard gone. She used her hands to sign frantically, but Elias couldn't understand. She grabbed his knife and threw it into the dark. The sound of the knife hitting the floor was captured instantly. The cave echoed the clink 10,000 times, turning the small noise into a thunderous roar of falling metal that brought Elias to his knees. Then, the god revealed itself. From the back of the cave, a shape emerged. It wasn't a monster of bone and fur. It was a mass of white, fibrous strands. Thousands of miles of vocal cords stolen from generations of victims, woven together into a towering, faceless pillar of meat. It began to vibrate, not with one voice, but with the combined screams of everyone who had ever died in Blackwood Hollow. The force of the sound hit Elias like a physical blow. His nose began to bleed. The leeches on his coat began to burrow toward his throat, trying to attach themselves to his larynx. They didn't want his life, they wanted his frequency. The pressure in the cave became unbearable. Elias felt his skin humming, his very DNA vibrating in sympathy with the towering pillar of white fibers. The god of echoes was no longer just a monster. It was a biological transmitter. The sound leeches on his jacket were now at his neck, their gelatinous bodies cold and vibrating. They were trying to synchronize their pulses with his vocal cords. If they succeeded, his throat would become a permanent extension of the god's voice. Clara grabbed him by the shoulders, her face inches from his. She didn't use her chalkboard. She took his hand and pressed it against her own throat. Elias felt nothing. Nobody Brashchin. No. Her throat was a dead zone, a literal anti-frequency. She pointed to his backpack, where his backup professional field recorder and a high-decibel portable speaker were tucked away. She then pointed to the god of echoes and made a shattering motion with her hands. Feedback, Elias gasped, his own voice sounding like a distorted radio signal. You want me to create an acoustic feedback loop? He understood the plan. In audio engineering, feedback occurs when a sound loop exists between an audio input, microphone, and an audio output, speaker. If he could capture the god's own god frequency and play it back at itself with a slight phase shift, the physical structure of the creature might shatter, just like a wine glass breaking at the right note. But there was a catch. To get a clean enough signal to destroy the entity, Elias had to be at the center of the vibration. He had to become the conductor. He scrambled to pull out his equipment. His hand was shaking so violently, he nearly dropped the XLR cables. He plugged the shotgun microphone into the recorder and connected the output to the high-power speaker. Elias, don't hurt him. The god began to scream using his mother's voice, his father's voice, and even his own voice from earlier that day. The leeches on the walls began to vibrate so hard that the cave ceiling started to flake off in jagged shards of limestone. I have to time this, Elias yelled to Clara. He aimed the microphone directly at the pulsating pillar of meat. The levels on his recorder hit the peak red lights instantly. He hit the phase invert button. Suddenly, a sound like 1,000 jet engines roared from his portable speaker. It was the anti-sound, the exact opposite frequency of the god's roar. For a second, there was a pocket of absolute, terrifying silence. The two waves canceled each other out. The god of echoes froze. Its fibrous body rippled in a wave of confusion. But then, the entity realized what was happening. It began to shift its frequency, searching for a hole in Elias's anti-sound. "It's adapting," Elias screamed. "Clara, I can't find a pitch. It's changing too fast." Clara looked at the god, then at Elias. She reached out and ripped the red wool from his ears. Then, she did the unthinkable. She stepped toward the god and opened her mouth. She had no voice, but she had space. As a mute, her vocal cavity was a perfect silent vacuum. She began to inhale the sound. The cave felt like it was being compressed by an invisible giant. Clara stood before the towering pillar of white fibers, her mouth open in a scream that produced no sound. She was acting as an acoustic black hole. Because she had no voice for the god to steal, her empty throat created a pocket of perfect silence that disrupted the god's broadcast. But the cost was horrific. Elias watched in terror as Clara's skin began to ripple. The sheer force of the god's vibrations, unable to find an echo in her, began to turn inward. Her nose bled a thick, black fluid, not blood, but liquefied Sound-Leeches that had dissolved under the pressure. "Clara, stop. It'll tear you apart." Elias screamed. He looked at his recorder. The waveform on the screen was a solid block of violet, a frequency so high it was beyond human hearing, yet it was vibrating the very marrow in his bones. The god of echoes was panicking. The fibrous pillar began to thrash, hitting the cave walls and causing massive stalactites to plummet like stone spears. It was trying to find a new host to broadcast through. It turned its eyeless mass toward Elias. Suddenly, Elias's headphones, still draped around his neck, erupted with sound. It wasn't his mother's voice anymore. It was a composite voice. The voices of every villager in Blackwood Hollow, including Silas, merged into one terrifying harmonic roar. "The silence is a sin. Feed the stone. Feed the stone." Outside the cave, the villagers were screaming into the wind, their voices being funneled into the cave's mouth. Silas was leading a vocal sacrifice, providing the god with the energy it needed to crush Clara's silence. Elias looked at the speaker. He looked at Clara, who was now collapsing, her eyes rolling back into her head. If he kept the feedback loop going, the god would shatter, but the resulting shockwave would liquefy Clara instantly. He looked at his digital master recorder. He had a third option. He didn't need to fight the sound. He needed to redirect it. "Clara, hold on." Elias grabbed a shotgun microphone and plunged it into the center of the god's fibrous mass. The machine shrieked. He turned the gain to its absolute limit, capturing the raw source of the god's power. Then, he didn't play it back. He connected his recorder to the village's public address system cables, which he had noticed earlier were strung through the cave for the villagers' rituals. He wasn't going to play an anti-frequency. He was going to play the truth. He hit broadcast. Instead of a roar, the speakers back in the village square erupted with the sound of the villagers' own secrets. The god didn't just store voices, it stored the intent behind them. The village heard Silas's hidden greed, the neighbors' whispered hatreds, and the sounds of the crimes they had committed to keep the god fed. The social harmony of Blackwood Hollow shattered. Back in the cave, the god of echoes shriveled. Its power came from the agreement of the village to stay silent and feed it. Now that the village was in a cacophony of their own revealed sins, the god was losing its tuning. But as the god weakened, it made one last, desperate move. It lunged at Elias, 1,000 white cords reaching out to stitch his mouth shut forever. The white, fibrous strands of the god didn't strike like a whip. They moved like a needle through silk. Before Elias could scream, the cords lashed across his face, cold and dry. He felt a sharp, rhythmic pricking, 1, 2, 10, 50, as the fibers wove themselves through his lips, sewing them shut with surgical precision. Elias fell to the ground, his muffled groans vibrating against the threads that now bound his jaw. The god of echoes shriveled back into the shadows of the cave, its broadcast broken, but its mark was left. As Elias clutched his face, the world didn't go silent. Instead, it became deafening. By stitching itself into Elias's flesh, the god had turned his nervous system into a universal receiver. He touched a wet stone to steady himself, and his mind was flooded with the sound of a tectonic plate grinding 1,000,000 years ago. He brushed against Clara's arm, and he heard the sound of her childhood laughter, a sound she had lost a decade ago. Everything had a sound. The moss hummed. The air whistled with the ghosts of ancient winds. He was no longer a man. He was a living record. Clara pulled him up. She saw the white threads across his mouth, and her eyes filled with a hollow grief. She knew this stitching. It was the final stage before a host became a permanent pillar of the cave. But there was no time for mourning. From the mouth of the cave, a flickering orange glow appeared. Silence the lies. Silas's voice echoed through the tunnels, but it was joined by the roar of dozens of others. The villagers were coming, driven into a collective psychotic break by the broadcast of their own hidden shames. They had turned into a lynch mob. They carried torches and long, rusted shears used for shearing sheep. They didn't want to feed the god anymore. They wanted to destroy everything that could repeat their sins. Clara grabbed a heavy iron rod from the debris and signaled for Elias to follow. They retreated deeper into the cave, moving toward a secondary exit known as the Ear Canal, a narrow, vertical chimney that led to the high moors. As they climbed, Elias's new hearing became a curse. He could hear the villagers' heartbeats from a mile away. He could hear the fire eating the oxygen. But worst of all, he could hear the god of echoes weeping behind him. It wasn't a monster's cry. It was the sound of 1,000 lost children. Elias stopped, his hand pressing against the limestone chimney. He heard the cave's history. The god wasn't an ancient evil. It was a primal mirror. It had been a silent crystal until the first humans arrived in the valley and filled it with their screams, their prayers, and their lies. The village hadn't been victims of the god. They had created it with their own noise. A torch was tossed into the chimney below them. There they are, a villager screamed. Elias looked up. The exit was a tiny circle of starlight, 50 feet above. He looked down and saw Silas, his face distorted by the firelight, his shears snapping rhythmically. Snip, snip, snip. Silas began to climb, his eyes fixed on Elias's stitched mouth. You've got a lot of stories in you now, Mr. Thorne, Silas hissed. I think it's time we cut them out. They burst out of the Ear Canal and onto the high moors, gasping for air that felt thin and cold. But for Elias, there was no relief. The open air was worse than the cave. Without the thick limestone to dampen the world, the stitching in his jaw acted like a massive antenna. He didn't just hear the wind. He heard the friction of the air molecules rubbing against the heather. He heard the worms churning the soil beneath his feet. He heard the distant, frantic heartbeat of a field mouse 3 miles away. Elias clutched his head, but even the sound of his own hands touching his hair was like a thunderclap. The white fibers were spreading. They were moving from his lips toward his ears and eyes, weaving a gossamer veil of bone-white silk across his face. He was becoming a human tuning fork. His identity was being drowned out by the noise of a universe. Clara grabbed him, forcing him to look at her. She saw the madness in his eyes. She knew that if the stitching reached his brain, Elias Thorne would cease to exist. He would become a static-filled shell, a permanent receiver for the god's echoes. Behind them, the villagers emerged from the chimney, their torches casting long, flickering shadows across the purple heather. They formed a wide, jagged circle, trapping Elias and Clara against a sheer cliff edge. Look at him, Silas whispered, his voice sounding to Elias like a tectonic shift. He's becoming the record. He's got all our voices in there. Every secret we ever told the stone, he's carrying them in his blood. Silas raised his shears. We can't let that record leave the valley. Clara stepped in front of Elias. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the only thing she had left, a small, sharp shard of obsidian she had taken from the cave's depths. She looked at Elias with a profound, tragic clarity. She began to perform a sacred muting. She didn't attack the villagers. Instead, she grabbed the white fibers on Elias's face. As she touched them, the noise in Elias's head suddenly peaked. A screaming, white light crescendo, and then absolute zero. Clara was grounding the sound. Because she was a perfect mute, she acted as a vacuum. She was sucking the frequency out of the stitches and into her own empty vessel. Elias's vision cleared. The white fibers on his face began to turn gray and brittle, falling away like dead skin. But as he was saved, Clara began to vibrate. Her skin turned the color of ash, and her eyes began to glow with a violent, violet light. She was taking on the weight of the entire valley's noise to give him a chance to breathe. Kill them both, Silas roared, sensing the power shifting. Before the girl explodes, the villagers surged forward. But as they did, the ground beneath the moors began to groan. It wasn't an earthquake. It was the response. Every sound the villagers had ever made, every lie, every scream, was now being channeled through Clara. She opened her mouth, and though she still had no voice, the force of the silence was so powerful it blew the torches out in an instant, plunging the moors into total, terrifying darkness. The moors were swallowed by a darkness so thick it felt like velvet. In the sudden absence of light, the villagers panicked. The sound of their heavy breathing and the clattering of their shears was all Elias could hear. But Clara was no longer just a woman. She was a static storm. Violet sparks danced across her fingertips. She was holding the collective frequency of Blackwood Hollow, and the pressure was causing her skin to crack like parched earth. "Give it to me." A voice hissed from the dark. It wasn't a roar or a scream. It was a voice of such perfect, terrifying clarity that Elias's knees buckled. A figure stepped into the center of the circle, illuminated by the dying embers of a dropped torch. It was Silas, but he looked different. His skin was smooth, his eyes were clear, and his voice was no longer that of a weathered innkeeper. "I was the first," Silas said, his voice shimmering with 1,000 overtones. 300 years ago, I was the village singer. I gave the stone my soul, so my voice would never age. I am the original that the god of echoes was built upon." Silas walked toward the vibrating Clara. "The girl is a vacuum, but I am the source. If I take the frequency she's holding, I can finally leave this valley. I can be a god of the world, not just a god of the holes." Elias realized the horror of the situation. Silas wasn't trying to protect the village. He was waiting for someone like Elias to trigger the god, and someone like Clara to collect it. He was a parasite waiting for his harvest. "Clara, don't let him touch you," Elias tried to shout, but his voice was a mere rasp through his damaged throat. Elias looked at his backpack. His main recorder was destroyed, but he still had his reference oscillators, small devices used to calibrate pitch. He also had the phase inverter module. He didn't need to record. He needed to sync. If he could synchronize the silence Clara was holding with the original frequency, Silas's voice, he could create a null zone, a space where no sound, no soul, and no god could exist. It would be an acoustic erasure. He crawled toward Clara, his fingers fumbling with the oscillators. He set them to the exact pitch of Silas's shimmering voice. "You think you can fight the music of the spheres with a toy?" Silas laughed. He reached out his hand to Clara's forehead. As their skin touched, a sound erupted that was beyond human comprehension. It was the sound of a star dying. The heather on the moors was instantly vaporized into white ash. The villagers were thrown back by a wall of pure kinetic energy. Elias slammed the phase inverter into the circuit. "Now, Clara," he mentally screamed. He didn't play a sound. He triggered the oscillator to sine wave 0. The result was a great resonance. The vibrating power in Clara and the ancient voice of Silas hit each other at a perfect 180-degree phase shift. The world turned white. Not the white of light, but the white of blank tape. The great resonance didn't end with a bang. It ended with the sudden, terrifying absence of everything. The white blankness of the null zone began to collapse inward. Silas didn't scream. He couldn't. As the phase inversion hit his original voice, his body began to pixelate and dissolve into gray static. He was a song being deleted from a master tape. His 300-year-old ego vanished into the vacuum of Clara's silence. Then, the ground gave way. The singing stone beneath the valley, the crystalline heart of the god of echoes, finally shattered under the pressure of the absolute zero frequency. The entire moors began to sink. The village of Blackwood Hollow, the ancient caves, and the pillars of stolen voices were all being pulled into a subterranean sinkhole. "Clara, we have to jump." Elias lunged for her. As he grabbed her hand, the violet glow in her eyes faded. The weight of the world's noise was gone. The god was dead, but as they scrambled toward the edge of the collapsing moor, Elias realized something was wrong. The stitching on his face was gone, but the new hearing remained. He could hear the tectonic plates of the earth shifting beneath them like grinding gears. He could hear the stars burning in the vacuum of space. The silence was gone forever. He was tuned to the frequency of the universe itself. They reached the crest of the hill, just as the valley floor vanished into a cloud of limestone dust and mist. The village of Blackwood Hollow was gone. Not a single stone remained. The morning after, Elias and Clara sat on the edge of a new canyon as the sun began to rise. For the first time in centuries, the wind over the moors didn't echo. It was just wind. Clara turned to Elias. She reached out and touched his throat. She opened her mouth, and for the first time in her life, a sound came out. It wasn't a stolen echo or a mimicry. It was a soft, shaky breath. "Arthur," she whispered. Elias froze. He looked at her, his eyes wide. Through his new hearing, he realized that her voice wasn't just a sound. It was a physical shape. He could see the vibrations of her breath painting the air in colors he had never imagined. But then he looked at his recording equipment, lying smashed and useless in the dirt. He looked at his hands, which were still vibrating with the hum of the earth. He had a choice. He could stay tuned in. He could be the man who hears the secrets of the world, the man who knows what the stones are thinking. But it would be a life of isolation, a life where a human voice would sound like a jackhammer. Or he could let go. Elias closed his eyes. He focused on the tiny, rhythmic pulse of his own human heart. He began to tune it down, mentally turning the gain knob of his soul until the sound of the stars faded, until the grinding of the earth became a distant muffle. He turned the world down until all he could hear was the soft breathing of the woman sitting next to him. He chose to be ordinary,